you've been around the channel long enough and seen some of the more obscure stuff I've done with regards to things like endurance racing and bits and pieces like that, you might have seen me reference the 1983 24 Hours of Le Mans, a race that Porsche dominated so hard with factory and customer entries that they did the Nobody's Perfect ad campaign. First, Porsche. Second, Porsche. Third, was also a Porsche. Fourth, fifth and sixth, also taken by Porsche. Eighth, that was a Porsche, correct. You're getting the idea now, aren't you? Ninth, that was... no, that was a Sauber BMW. But 10th was also a Porsche. There has been an updated one since for the 2024 season where it showed everything that Porsche won this year, but it seemed to be just cherry picking, with some of the stuff being from the same race. It doesn't hit as hard as this one did, because locking out the top 10 except one at Le Mans is something that just wouldn't happen these days with BOP and stuff like that. But that Porsche, the 956, was just so good that everybody wanted one, and it didn't matter how much it cost because it was going to be able to beat anything and everything so long as it finished. Like I said, BOP and stuff like that would prevent a repeat of this from happening. And if you're interested, I've already done a video on the 956 called, funnily enough, So Good Everybody Wanted One. I did that video about a year ago, as it so happens, and Ben Collins called it his hero car, and I'm pretty partial to it myself. But that summed up the early years of Group C. If you wanted to win, you had to buy one of those Porsches you'd heard so much about. And that was because Porsche had cracked the formula. Endurance formula are very much boom and bust. Look at LMP1 most recently. It had its boom around 2015, 2016 or so, and then it went bust, thanks to things like escalating costs, Dieselgate and other things. I know people love the LMP1 cars, and I love LMP1s as well because they're four-wheel drive spaceships, but LMP1 was only good in that era when it was Audi, Porsche and Toyota, with that brief cameo from Nissan. Before that, there was Group C, the time when people built massive powerful cars that ran flat out for 24 hours straight at Le Mans. Except that, well, it didn't happen, did it, Homer? Group C, as much as people don't want to hear it, was a fuel efficiency formula. Manufacturers reaped their rewards by staying out of the pits by being the most frugal on fuel whilst running the most obscene engine configurations known to man. And the rules reflected this. During the 1982 24 Hours of Le Mans, cars could only make 24 fuel stops, so they would pit roughly once every hour, meaning that they had to average something in the region of 4.7 miles to the gallon. It was the BOP of the time. Those fuel economy rules meant that if you wanted to, you could run a 5-litre V12 while another manufacturer ran a 2-litre turbo inline 6. So Porsche, with their engine that was powerful and frugal in equal measure, didn't have to save as much as the others, so they could run harder for longer, while other manufacturers had to save a little bit and run slower lap times. And this still happens today. Lift and coast, save that little bit of fuel, and then have that sprint towards the finish with as little fuel left in the car as possible because lighter car is faster car, and also on fresh tyres that will also help you. It's a bit like how like a 10,000 metre runner will pace themselves for a bit and then let it all loose within the final 150 metres or so to take the tape and win the race. And all of this meant that with Porsche winning and dominating and all the other manufacturers involved, Group C by the mid to late 80s had become as popular as Formula 1. But there was that lingering feeling of what's the point? Because by the time 1986 ended, Porsche had won every year at Le Mans from 1976, except twice. That being in 1978 when an Alpine driven by Jean-Pierre Jousseau and Didier Pironi won, and again in 1980 when Jousseau, I can't pronounce his name, and Jean Rondeau won in a car built by Rondeau's own company. After that, if you wanted to win at Le Mans, you had to be in the Porsche factory team or with Joest, I think that's how it's pronounced, to stand a chance. And it also helped if your name was Jackie X, Derek Bell or Klaus Ludwig. Porsche would take one more win in 1987 with the 962, which should be another video for the future if I've not already done it, before somebody else decided it was time to step up. Jaguar had already been involved with Group C racing. In 1984, the boys from Coventry/Birmingham had called up Tom Walkinshaw, who had successfully run XJSs in the European Touring Car Championship, to design and build a Group C homologated prototype to tackle the World Sports Car Championship, which is now the World Endurance Championship. And any future references to the World Sports Car Championship will just be WEC for simplicity in getting through this story. The XJR6 was designed by Tony Southgate, who had Formula 1 experience with BRM, Shadow and Arrows, and he'd also designed Ford's RS2000 rally car. The S in Arrows is for Southgate, as the name Arrows was a mashup of Ambrosio, Rees, Oliver, Was and Southgate, similar to how March was Mosley, Alan Rees, Coker and Hurd. See also Ilmore and Cosworth. Southgate had also been part of Ford's C100 project and had joined Tom Walkinshaw Racing in 1984, and Walkinshaw, ironically, would purchase Arrows, where Southgate had been a founding member. Using his experience with the Ford C100, Southgate had come up with what was deemed to be a revolutionary design for the time. He designed a carbon fibre monocoque chassis that had Venturi tunnels built in to help suck the car to the ground. Porsche had already run Venturi tunnels on the 956 to great effect, with there being a car at the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart upside down. Well, at least I hope it's still there, to show off how much downforce that it could produce. And ground effect was totally legal in the Group C era, so long as the cars kept within the rules. After seeing how insane things had gotten in Formula 1, the FIA mandated that a set amount of the floor had to be flat. The car made its debut at the 1,000 kilometres of Motorsport in Canada in 1985. One car retired and the other finished third, but it was 19 laps down on the race-winning Porsche. It was then fifth at Spa, although the race was abandoned after the fatal crash of Stefan Beloff, and then retired at Brands Hatch. It got withdrawn at Fuji due to the weather, and then came second at Selangor. Now, I'd never heard of that track prior to today, but it's in Malaysia. In 1986, the car went on a diet to lose a lot of weight and get it closer to the minimum 800 kilos, and then went and won at Silverstone, with second places coming at Spa and the Norris Ring. And this was seen as being a good haul for Jaguar. The company was in the hands of British Leyland, and the bosses there were trying to see if they could repair the reputation of the brand, which had suffered under British Leyland's ownership. If you've seen the Top Gear British Leyland Challenge, you'll have seen that the cars that came out of Birmingham at the time were, well, not particularly well made. Doors falling off when you filled the cars with water, unable to hold helium, and so on. So 1987 rolls around and Jaguar's looking to update the car, and unlike a lot of the stuff that's happening with Jaguar lately, this car was a proper Jag. It was going to be designed around Jaguar's 7-litre V12, and when Southgate was told his next car had to be designed around this monster, he apparently uttered a swear word under his breath and got to work. The engine he had before was 6.2 litres. This thing was almost a full litre bigger on the old cubic centimeterage, and he had to somehow package a small, lightweight car around a hulking great V12, and that was going to be tricky. And it wasn't going to be his first time packaging a car around a V12, because he'd done it for BRM, Shadow and Osella, but that was a little bit different because the engines in Formula 1 were smaller. But this hulking great engine he'd been sent from Castle Bromwich had first been used in the E-Type. Jaguar was using Jaguar parts, not really going the full bespoke route. So how did they package everything up? They put the engine as far forward as it would possibly go. Any further forward and it would have been where the centre console would be. And then they made the wheelbase longer than it otherwise would be to get the weight distribution sorted out, because the engine, just on its own, weighed 300 kilos. But the engine did have some upsides. While it was tall, given that it had a 60-degree V-angle, it was narrow at the same time, which allowed Southgate to go to town with the aero once they figured out what they were going to do with it. Thanks to the narrow engine, the Venturi tunnels could be made as big as they could possibly get them, and some small modifications were made to the engine so it would be made even narrower, such as taking the starter motor off the side of the engine and moving it to the front so everything was optimised. Then came the design brief from the higher-ups about how to design the bodywork. Max out the downforce. They did, and out of the TWR factory came the XJR8. From the outside it looked somewhat similar to what had come before, but Jag had made about 64 major changes to the car, and Jag seemed to be quite hush about the engine, because when it turned up to race, people thought that they were still running the same engine as before. But they weren't running the same engine as before. It was now producing 720 horsepower and could hit 220 miles an hour in a straight line. For the first time since 1982, Porsche was beaten in the World Endurance Championship. Well, they weren't just beaten, they were utterly smashed. The XJR8 utterly rinsed the season, taking wins at Jarama, Jerez, Monza, Silverstone, Brands, the Nürburgring, Spa and Fuji, with either the number 4 or number 5 car. The number 6, driven by Raoul Boesel, Martin Brundle and Johnny Dumfries, won at Spa. Not for the first time, something from the Midlands had given the Germans an utter hiding. Now the reason I say that is, the Jaguar factory in Castle Bromwich produced Spitfires during the war. Now I know this car wasn't produced in Castle Bromwich, but Jaguar took ownership of the factory in 1977. There's a massive monument to the Spitfires on a roundabout near the factory entrance, and everybody around here knows it as Spitfire Island. But the big one still eluded them. Le Mans. Le Mans was still Porsche's domain, although it has to be said that the Porsche factory team didn't bother turning up to the rest of the WC rounds following Le Mans in 1987 because they were too focused on kart in the US to care, but there was still competition from the likes of Joest and Kramer. And Jag kept the 7-litre V12 monster for the following year, and the car evolved into the XJR9. This car was entered into IMSA with a smaller 6-litre V12 and ended up winning the 24 Hours of Daytona with Boesel, Brundle, John Nielsen and Jan Lammers. When the WEC season started, Brundle's car would retire from Jerez, but then won at Jarama, Monza, Silverstone, got second at Brno, won again at Brands Hatch, and then took second places at the Nürburgring and Spa. Brundle returned to the top step at Fuji before coming third at Sandown. That Brundle fella was pretty handy in sports cars, and people need to start putting respect on his name. But the big prize finally came as Jaguar beat Porsche at Le Mans to end the streak that had been going for the Germans since 1980. Lammers, Andy Wallace and Johnny Dumfries brought the car home despite the engine getting a bit long in the tooth by this point. It only had 2 valves per cylinder, while most had gone to 4 valves per cylinder for better airflow or something, I don't know, I'm not an engine guy. But one thing that helped them is that they were still returning decent power levels. They could run the engine quite lean, and this was easier to do without damaging the engine with 12 cylinders versus having 6, 8 or even 10. In 1989 they switched to using a 3.5 litre Rover V6 that was turbocharged, and it didn't go well for them. Reliability let them down, and the only race they won was at Silverstone. But in 1990 they came back, and like in 1988 they did the endurance double, Daytona and Le Mans. The XJR12 returned to the 7-litre V12 for this race only, and Jaguar finished 1-2 with Nielsen, Price, Cobb and Brundle being the 3 winning drivers, with Lammers, Wallace and Franz Conrad in the sister car. In third was an all-British lineup in a 962 of Anthony Reid, David Sears and Timothy Nadell, better known as Tiff. It was also Jag's last hurrah, as the company would be sold to Ford at the end of the year. Unfortunately, there aren't any examples of this car to drive in The Sims, at least not at an official level. Official meaning it's been made by the developer. I do have this mod for the original R Factor, but, and no disrespect to the mod creators, these mods tend to be hit and miss and, well, it's a video game. And the reason I use grainy sim racing footage and models is because there can be a distinct lack of images that I can use. So it's all for a reason, and at least gives you a starting point to go and find pictures of your own. However, I did find some information about how it was to drive from somebody who's actually driven it. Motorsport magazine did a thing back in the November of 2021 where Andrew Frankel got to take the 87 car for a drive around Thruxton, and he said that any thinking you'd have of it being easier to drive than a 962 goes out of the window once you've got your foot down, and you have to be super smooth with it. It wanted to lose the rear under braking, but you could be pretty hard with the throttle coming out of a corner, albeit with the risk of spinning it out if you are too heavy with that right foot. The tightness of the diff made it want to understeer in the slower corners, so the final chicane in particular at Thruxton, but even then, once the car had warmed up, it could go through Church Corner borderline flat out in 5th gear. So the general consensus was that this car was very, very, very physically demanding to drive, but it wasn't the undrivable, overpowered death trap that a lot of people seem to think that these Group C cars were. But the car had a decent haul of race wins considering, in Southgate's own words, it was the size of a fish and chip shop, given how cramped and compact the cockpit was on this thing. But it's a beautiful car, and down the Mulsanne it must have been so easy to pick out, noise-wise, over the other cars that were running by. But by 1991, things had taken a turn. Group C was losing popularity. The 1991 24 Hours of Le Mans had to make several concessions and then ballasted the hell out of all the other cars. The 787B excluded thanks to its loophole, and while we're here, can we stop peddling this myth that the 787B was rapid? But back to the point. The 3.5 litre formula had taken full effect, meaning that Jag had to lose the turbochargers. Ford's new ownership meant that the car was running a Ford HB V8 that seemed to have been lifted from a Formula 1 car, and it was absolutely cack. After the season finished, with a car that Martin Brundle described as the worst he'd ever driven, Jaguar was gone from Group C, and the category would be dead less than 6 months later. But the Jag did the job. It won races, it won titles, it won Le Mans, but most importantly, it beat the Porsches. And when you factor in the Silk Cut sponsorship and the Silk Cut colours as well, you've got a proper bedroom poster. And an icon for motorsport fans the world over. So then, a look at Jaguar's Group C effort and how it all came to be. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get the bell on if you haven't already, so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks to the mad lads at Patreon who support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you want to buy me a coffee and or a beer over this Christmas New Year period, and memberships if you want to do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.